Hi, folks. Layman Pascal here. Welcome to another installment of the Integral Stage series on psychotherapeutics, exploring the theory and practice of developmental, multidimensional, personal and impersonal, and interpersonal psychological maturation, structure building, healing, and self-discovery. Amen. Today, we're joined by Dr. Joseph Dillard, who is prolific on themes from dream yoga to Chinese history, from international law to critical takes on integral theory, from cosmology to therapy. He and I share a passion for exploring the role of ethics in human development and maybe the role of neo-shamanic practice in spirituality, health, and sanity. And hopefully we'll get to those topics a little later, but first we're going to do something a bit different for us. We're going to explore the integral deep listening approach that Joseph has crafted over the years. So he'll give us a general orienting overview, and then he'll sort of walk me through a bit of the process, and maybe we'll slide into some other topics after that. Hi, Joseph.
Hey, it's great to be here with you.
It's always so interesting to personalize in real time somebody who you're used to seeing as just a poster on the internet or as the author of written material.
Absolutely. And from that introduction, you missed your calling. I don't know if you've ever been a DJ, but wow, you'd make a great one.
I had a radio show here for a couple of years. But I appreciate that. So tell us a little bit about your approach.
Well, Layman, when I've been thinking about what I could say that might really be useful to people. And so much of what we say is culturally conditioned by our time and place. What issues are really going to be important to people 500 years from now? There's, of course, a lot of them. Things like human nature, it's still going to be there. How we treat each other, it's still going to be a big deal. I think that one particular issue that I would like to focus on that I think is going to be important in 500 years is that of trance, which is, I think, what got you contacting me in the first place. Is I had written an article on shamanism. And shamanism is an incredible aspect of human history in that I believe that the trance state awakened humanity to potentials of human development that they just were not aware of before. And I also believe that dreaming, their dreams, played a large part in awakening to the shamanic experience. Because guess what? The most common trance state that all of us experience in life is every night when we go to sleep, we dream. If we live to be 80, we spend about 5 to 6 years of our life dreaming. And I was scripted real early. I grew up in the Presbyterian and then the Episcopal Church, Bible stories. And one of them that I found fascinating was Joseph, dream interpreter to Pharaoh. There was some scripting that I was not aware of. I think that I really got affected by that. I was interested in Egyptian archaeology in my youth. And then my grandmother had a metaphysical library, and I became familiar with the work of Edgar Cayce, who was called the Sleeping Prophet, the father of holistic medicine. And one of the things that he said in the amazing medical and psychic readings that he gave in a hypnotically induced trance state was that all the important things in our life are first experienced or previewed in our dreams. Now, I heard that when I was about 12, and I thought to myself, if that's right at all, then I need to start paying attention to my dreams. So I started keeping a dream journal. Started reading all about Cayce's theories of symbology, which I found out later were very much like Carl Jung's. I became associated with the ARE, the Association for Research and Enlightenment, which was Edgar Cayce's organization, to explore his work, and taught a lot of dream workshops and meditation workshops based on that approach in my late teens and early 20s. And what I found was that I was uncomfortable with it. And the reason why I was uncomfortable is I was telling people what their dreams meant based on some calculated guesses, based on studying symbology, etc. And it just felt awkward. It felt like I was being quite presumptuous to know what somebody else's experience was. But I didn't know what else to do. In graduate school, I had the experience of studying the work of J.L. Marino, who most people know as the creator of psychodrama. He coined the word group therapy, and he also developed something called sociometry. And sociometry is basically a way of asking people about their preferences. Who would you most like to go on a talk show with Layman Pascal with? You know, who would you least like to go on the talk show with? And you could collect these preferences and tabulate them and put them in a diagram called a sociogram. And the result was that you could have a pictorial representation of the dynamics of this internal of this group that was not obvious at all.
So you're moving, just to clarify, you're moving from like a representational version of interpreting dream and trance content to one that involves sort of a set of evaluations, a complex set of evaluations in response to that content, and thinking that that's a more accurate mapping than just trying to associate it with what this stands for.
Yes. It really hit me like a ton of bricks, Layman. And the reason why is that when I started interviewing different characters in dreams and asking them their preferences toward other characters in the same dream, plus their reaction to the different emotions in the dream, the different actions in the dream, and had them elaborate on these choices, I was amazed at what kinds of interpretations of the dream came out. They were multi-perspectival in that there was more than one, and they were very autonomous, which meant that they didn't agree with mine necessarily at all. Also, it really didn't have anything to do with symbology. They weren't saying this is a symbol of that, nor did these perspectives represent themselves as symbols. Just like you're not primarily a symbol, you're primarily yourself. And then those meanings that I project onto you, we could say are symbolic significances for me, but that's not who you really are. You're more than a symbol. So what really got me was that this was a intrasocial form of multi-perspectivalism. And when I got into it, I realized that as one tabled their own assumptions, you created a phenomenally based experiential, because it's experiential because you're disidentifying with yourself as you do in a trance when you go into a trance, and then you're identifying with another perspective. So it's a phenomenologically based experiential multi-perspectivalism, which is somewhat different than a cognitively based multi-perspectivalism, which is like a worldview. And this ties into the difference between psychological geocentrism, which is like a Ptolemaic worldview where reality orbits around my own sense of who I am and how I see the world. And that's true, that's real. And then there is a heliocentric form of this, a psychological heliocentrism. And the psychological heliocentrism is where it's analogous to Copernican Earth and planets orbiting around the sun. What's going on is that we identify generally through trance experiences and meditation experiences with all, with everything. And our sense of self becomes the center of reality. The ego or the self becomes the capital self, or Atman, or deity, whatever name you want for it. Okay.
I'm now in orbit around myself, as opposed to treating myself as that which everything is orbiting around.
You have now expanded your identity to where you are one with the source of everything. Okay. You are these things that are orbiting around you as well as the center of your reality. Okay. And I think that's what different kinds of trance and mystical experiences do, whether they're nature or devotional or formless or Turiya experiences. That's what they tend to do. Now, there's a third type, and that's the cosmology that has been presented to us post-Copernican, and that is a polycentric sense of reality, where there is no center point to reality. Every point is the center, okay? And that is the kind of identity that is amplified within us if we do enough of this interviewing, not only with dream characters, but with the personifications of our life issues. And I'll show you how that works in a bit. Hopefully we'll get into a demo here in a minute. So the first name of this was called dream sociometry because it was based on Marino's sociometry, but it worked with dreams. But when I realized that you could work with life issues just as if they were dreams, I realized that it was a dream yoga where it was a transpersonal discipline on the level of the subtle. It involved subjective sources of objectivity that were more subjectively enmeshed in our daily life than normally occurs with meditational practice, which is an abstract or a completely objective form of objectivity. If that difference is clear, I'm not sure if I'm clear or not. Is that clear or not?
It's pretty clear to me, but I can understand how it might be a slippery term for people. Maybe you want to say a couple more words about that distinction.
Well, I'll do my best. If we think about the difference in terms of Nirmanakaya, Sambhogakaya, what happens is that people will have a trance experience where they have their circuits blown open. They want to be one with everything. They want to move into this totality of objective oneness where everything seems to be relatively trivial in relationship to this experience. And what happens is people throw around the term spiritual bypass. I don't particularly care for it. I don't use the term, but it's more skipping the step of identification with forms of objectivity that have to do with the subtle realm. Okay? Mm-hmm. In other words, you're moving right to causal and formless or Turiya. You're wanting enlightenment, where what this work does is develops forms of objectivity that are authentic and autonomous, but are not that objective as causal levels or Turiya. And the advantage of that, the reason you want to do that is because that's where we're stuck. We're stuck in our everyday reality, and we're looking for solutions or ways to make our everyday lives better. And so the result is that this stream yoga, which I expanded and called integral deep listening, is a practical and an injunctive approach rather than a via affirmativa or a via negativa. It's essentially perform this experiment, test it for yourself. That way, after I'm dead and gone, people can follow the same recipe, and it won't be about me. It won't be about my particular worldview. It'll be about people listening to and learning from their own authentic sources of objectivity that come from their own dreams or the personifications of their own life issues.
So this is the integral deep listening thing. I was going to ask you, like, why do you get to call it integral? But from what you've been saying there, right, it's clearly multi-perspectival. It clearly is involving multiple states of consciousness, and it's framed in a way where these different analogically cosmic stages that you're talking about, and where the healing practice is also something that can provoke development to sort of different scales of psychology. So that sounds legit.
Yes to those things. And I would say one of the ways, I mean, really, I use the word integral as a way of honoring Ken Wilber and his entire model, because I had studied philosophy, psychology, and comparative religion in university, gotten pretty deep into Nagarjuna's Madhyamika, pretty deep into Chinese humanism, Hinduism, and I think I'm very much like most of the people who are likely to listen to this, and that they wouldn't be listening if they hadn't been impacted in powerful ways by that work. So although I am a critic and a kind of a skunk at the picnic regarding a lot of things, ideas within integral, it's only because I care a lot. I care deeply because of the importance of the whole theoretical format. And like the 4 quadrants, interviewing, one goes into a light trance state and interviews these aspects, which I call emerging potentials, because that seems to be a pretty good verbal philosophy kind of a way of defining what they are. And what happens is that you have something called triangulation, that I call triangulation. Most of us problem solvers make decisions based on our own judgment. And then we Google or we ask people that we respect, like Layman Pascal, for their opinion. And then what we do is we make our best determination based on that. Triangulation adds the perspective of these interviewed emerging potentials as a way of checking the other 2 sources against each other. These are not gods, these are not deities, these are not gurus. They're just alternative perspectives that one, the reason why you want to get in touch with them in the first place, I should say this, is because they know you better than any guru possibly could. They know you better than any expert possibly could. And because they're a part of you, they're subjectively enmeshed in your reality, so they know where you're stuck. So for instance, as a psychotherapist for some 40 years, I'm trained to do a history, then to work up a diagnosis, and then to do treatment. I cannot tell you how mistaken I have been so many times when I have listened to these perspectives, done interviews with them, and compared their diagnosis with my own. It's been totally embarrassing, because it's a cliche, but we know what we need to do. We know our own truth. Okay? A lot of times where we get stuck is that our priorities are wrong. We think that our priorities are good. Oh, this person is my soulmate. Boy, I've just got to get together with them. I know I'm going to be happy. And so we think we know our own mind. We think we know what's best for us. We think we know our priorities. We might even ask for a dream for validation. We get a dream. We think that it's validating that this person is our soulmate. Then down the line, few months, few years, few decades, it goes south. And then when it does, people can turn off the dreams and say, well, you can't trust dreams. Why should I even look at them? Because I was betrayed by my dreams. Well, it really has to do with a psychologically geocentric source of the interpretation of the dream rather than a polycentric, multi-perspectival approach to understanding it. That's the basic mistake that I think has traditionally made with dreamwork. Now, one of the things, I should say this, one of the things that has kept me going on this is that after working on several hundred of my own dreams, starting in 1980, because I just didn't believe what I was seeing, it was so different from what I'd experienced, I gradually started working with clients. And what I found was that I had got some really amazing results with certain kinds of clients. For instance, agoraphobics, people who could not go outside and be in social situations. I had one lady who was so much into her agoraphobia, she could not only not leave her home, but she wrote a newsletter of all the different treatment modalities because she had tried them. After about 4 or 5 interview sessions with this, her agoraphobia cleared up. And I went, wow, that's amazing. And then I worked with a lot of kinds of different anxiety disorders, including post-traumatic stress disorder with people. One lady who had head injury from an IED in Iraq, affective disturbances where she'd yell at her kids and she'd get in arguments with her spouse, that kind of a thing. Plus her judgment was poor and she was fighting her cognitive therapy because the whole idea that she had changed was too threatening to her. One interview reframed her entire perspective on her head injury and allowed her to stop fighting, yelling at her kids, and settle down and do her cognitive therapy. That really impressed me. I had a lady who was attacked by terrorists in Israel, and she had recurring nightmares, full-blown PTSD for years. I didn't even talk to her. I just emailed her and I said, do this. She did it. She wrote back and said, it's just amazing. My nightmares have stopped. I no longer am super vigilant. I no longer have these waking reliving of the experience. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And my feeling was, well, I didn't really do anything, So maybe that's lead into our experience of doing an interview with you. And that is, people who get the best results are those who have the greatest need. And it's not as if you will hear new things. It's more about reframing and a shifting of our priorities to move toward what I call our life compass, which means something different than an inner sense of knowingness. It's different than our intuition. It's different than our sense, than a conscience. It is when you interview multiple emerging potentials, what you end up seeing are patterns that recur in terms of recommendations. And these tend to point toward a consistent inner direction, like the pattern in an acorn to become an oak, something that is innate to each individual. And that's really what we look for in this process, is to help people to awaken to what is uniquely and individually their own path forward, not what I think they ought to do.
Well, I can't guarantee that my level of experienced need is very high, but I'm always excited to learn more about my unique nature. So let's try to show people a little bit about how this process works.
Great. What I'm going to do is, as I walk you through this, I'm going to explain some of what we're doing as an aside. I hope that will not interrupt the process, and we'll just play with that and see how well that works.
Yeah, we'll see how it goes.
So Layman, the way we always start on this is by asking for 3 life issues. And the reason why is that we want the process to be relevant and practical for who you are in your everyday life.
Okay. When you say life issues, what do you mean by that? Well, what am I looking for?
What are you looking for?
What could be better in my life? Or what am I also working on? Let's see. I have thoughts around the relationship between making money and the amount of efforts that I do. I want those more closely correlated. I have a certain pattern of periodic angry explosion in very specific intimate relationships that goes back to my childhood. And food is a very interesting issue. Like, I think a lot of people I know look at me as if I have it more together around food compared to them, but it's a perpetually unresolved issue. I feel very far from where I want to be, even if it impresses some other people relative to where they are.
Totally understand. So, as an aside, the reason we ask for 3 life issues is because it causes people to dig. A lot of times it's hard for them to come up with 3, okay? Typically what happens is that people in my role will then ask questions to get clear about these. But that's not what we do with integral deep listening, because it's not important that I understand these, because I'm not going to diagnose. I'm not going to interpret. Okay? That's not my role. Okay? So I really don't need to understand those 3 life issues, which is totally different from what psychotherapists normally do. Okay? The assumption is they have to understand what's going on. This is so cool because you can be stupid, like me, you can be stupid. Also, kids can do this with other kids. It's not like you have to be at some kind of frigging transpersonal level of development in order to do this process. Kids can do this with kids. People in jail can do this with other people in jail. You can be a sociopath and you can follow the steps and do it. So of those 3 life issues, which one rings your bell the most? Which one seems to be the most important to you?
Well, I'll tell you, it's the food one that bugs me the most.
Cool. Okay.
I feel like the other ones are problematic, but I kind of have a handle on it.
Yeah.
I'm working. The food one, I just I just never feel like it's enough.
Yeah. And what's so interesting is typically, maybe your experience is different, but what gurus will tend to do is they will tell you to meditate on it and transcend the issue in some way or another. That's not what this is about at all. Again, those are more like formless or non-dual approaches instead of a subtle level intervention. And this is more of an intervention on that level. I don't have anything against interventions on different levels. I'm just saying that that's where this one focuses on.
Right.
Okay. Now, at this juncture, we have an interesting choice that's kind of fun. We could either segue into you telling me a dream. It could be something that was a fever dream when you were 2. It could be a nightmare. It could be a repetitive dream. It could be something that you've worked on for years and you're sure you figured out and you know exactly what it means. It could be something that you're sure is day residue left over from that pepperoni pizza you had after watching that slasher flick. Okay? So it really doesn't matter. Now, and that's door number 1, is you could tell a dream. And we could approach this whole thing that way. Or door number 2 is we just go directly with that life issue food.
There's a dream I'm thinking of that recurred in childhood quite a bit. And I feel like it's interesting, but I think it's also a little bit cleaner and safer than going right at the life issue.
I'm all for clean and safe.
All right, I'll tell you a dream that recurred to me and was terrifying when I was a kid. And what was interesting to me at the time, at least one of the things, was I would have other dreams that were more stereotypically scary and they didn't bother me. Right? I frequently, would fall off a building and think, oh no, and then hit the ground and think, oh, that's fine. Or I remember one time I got eaten by a crocodile and I was just in the crocodile. I'm like, okay, this is fine. I don't know why I was worried about that. But this,
were you worried about giving the poor crocodile indigestion?
No, I should have been more empathic in my crocodile dream. But I would have this other dream, and I had it on multiple occasions. and it was extremely abstract. It was like I was floating in a space next to a very precise sequence of dots. And those dots were proceeding toward a large kind of beige mass in the distance. And then a wedge-like shape of the same color beige would come, and it would interrupt the flow of this sequence of dots. And it was terrifying. I would wake up with anxiety from this dream, and I would have it on multiple occasions. And it really puzzled me because it was so abstract, and I was so not bothered by very concrete, seemingly horror dreams. I was just okay with those. So this, the recurring geometry of this dream was, it perturbed me many times in youth.
Okay, I'm so glad you shared this, because this is really a great example of a dream that one can work with. And you can go to the dream dictionaries and you get all these different ideas about what dots are and what shapes and being in outer space are and all that kind of stuff. And that would be you doing a psychologically geocentric interpretation of the dream.
Right.
Yeah. So what we want to do is something different. These are the characters that I heard you say. There's a you, there's space, there's these dots, and then there's this wedge. Yes?
Yeah. And a thing on the far side where the dots are going toward, whatever that mass is there.
Okay. Thank you. And of those different characters, which one interests you the most or intrigues you the most?
Well, it's interesting because the mass just bubbled out of me. I wanted to make sure that one was in there. And right now that's more interesting to me. But I think when I was a kid and it bothered me, it was the wedge.
Okay. So which would you prefer to look at or go with?
Let's look at the mass, because I am the person I am now.
Okay. That's great. And a lot of times the next step that we'll use is I'll just ask you if you have any associations to this dream, any thoughts about why you might have had it. And the reason why we ask that, it has to do with the phenomenologically based aspect of this work. What we're attempting to do is we're attempting to surface so we can table your assumptions, your interpretations, to get them out of the way as we proceed.
The only real association I have with it is it's around the same time I started becoming interested in meditation. And I was there was a part of me that would be really intrigued by the state of consciousness that I was in as I was falling asleep. And sometimes I would try certain practices. I had a very vague understanding of meditation because I was very young, but I would be trying to do things to my own mind to see what happened. And I had a sense that this nightmare often happened as an extension of that process.
Okay, very cool. Thank you. So what I'd like you to do is to imagine that you are this mass in the dream, and I would like to have you describe yourself to us, mass.
Well, I'm much larger than the person who's looking at me. I'm kind of flesh toned. I think I'm maybe there's a sort of a fold in me, and it's I have some maternal and sexual flavors, but I don't know that those characterize me exactly. There's a sort of inertness to me, like I have no special agenda whatsoever.
Are you above Layman? Are you under him? Are you inside him? Are you all around him? Where are you?
I'm in front of him, but I'm much larger than him, so I could see that it might look to him as if I was enveloping him.
Mm-hmm. And what do you like most about yourself, Mass?
I like my flavor. I don't know if you ever like smell the inside of your own nostrils or something like that. Just like there's a sense in which the fleshiness of me is inherently pleasurable to myself.
Very cool. Thank you very much for that. And Mass, is there anything you dislike about yourself?
I don't. I'm not really cool with freaking Layman out. That's not what I'm after. And also the part of the fold that is sort of in my front. The fold is partly really nice, but there's a tension in part of it that I would love to let go of.
Okay. And if you were to personify some aspect of Layman, what would that most closely be, Mass?
Yeah. There's some really easy options. I don't want to say, it's not quite right to say that I'm his body or his mother or women or something like that. I'm as much a beach as I am something biological. So I mean, the relationship of his mental capacity to nature in general, it might be closer to what I am.
Thank you. And now I'd like to flip that question, Mass, and ask you that if Layman were some aspect of you, if he personified some aspect of you, Mass, what aspect of you would he most closely represent or personify?
I immediately want to say two things. The first thing is that part of how he seems to me as me is the same as the tension element that is deep in the fold. But at the same time, I feel like I need to be critiqued, and he can offer me that. I can't meet my own objectives just by the way I behave. Somebody has to call me on some of this.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Thank you very much for that, Mass. Now, since you're an imaginary character out of a Layman's dream when he was a kid, that means that you can change if you want to right now. In other words, if you want to be different in some way, like you could be a rhinoceros if you wanted to be, or you could be a toilet brush if you wanted to be. Or guess what? You could stay the same if you like the way you are. So don't change because Layman might want you to change, because this is not his dream. This is your dream. This is your experience right now, Mass. We're talking to you. So it's really up to you. If you want to change, then what feels good to you? If you don't, then that's cool.
The instant that you reminded me of that option, I experienced myself sort of turning into a bird and rising up and vanishing a little bit. And the bird was, let's say, a raven as opposed to a crow. A large wingspan, but we didn't have that kind of dense caw-y thing that crows have. It was very, very fluttery and expansive, and then kind of vanished into the clouds. So
okay,
I
so
instinctively
Raven,
made that transform.
So Raven, could you show us yourself? Show us what you're like.
It's that bit there, like the sudden leap up from a thing that's already flying. It's the raven being absorbed into the cloud.
And how was that for you, Raven?
Spot on.
How so, Raven?
That it epitomizes and completes what I'm here to do. It was a perfect fulfillment of my function, like as it had a destined feel to it.
So Raven, what do you think about this folded mass that you wore before? Do you have any thoughts about that?
It looks intriguing, delicious, and unproblematic.
And Raven, now that you're leaping up with your wings into the sky, how would you score yourself 0 to 10 in confidence? So 0 means you're a scared raven. A 5 means, got to watch out for things out there in the world. And a 9 or 10 means, hey, I don't have any fear of anything.
Yeah,
Where would you say you are?
I'm in the nines for sure. Maybe I'll give it a 9.2.
That sounds great, Raven. And Raven, how would you score yourself 0 to 10 in empathy? And empathy isn't just thinking that you know how other ravens feel or Layman feels or thinks, but it's like confirmed, like your ability to have your sense of what others are experiencing validated. How good at that do you think you are, or how important is it? It might not be important to you at all, Raven.
Yeah, I'm certainly experiencing it much more as let's say compassion rather than empathy. I would love for the mass and layman to feel what I'm feeling. I'm not totally clear on whether I want to feel what they're feeling.
What are you feeling that you would like them to feel, Raven?
Expansive levity and trust.
Okay. And Raven, how would Layman's life be different if he were to feel that expansive levity and trust sort of as his routine default state of mind? Would his life be different, or would it be the same? What?
I think he would do mostly the same things, but there's a lot of additional activity that might go on in him that he wouldn't have to do. Like, I think it would be a lot less work for him.
Mm-hmm. Things would get easier, simpler.
Yeah, cleaner and easier, more streamlined, lubricated.
Mm-hmm. Are there particular times in Layman's everyday life, any particular situations in the course of his day, when you think it would be helpful for him to become you, Raven, and to experience life from your perspective?
Yeah, I think there are several situations every day where he is trying to do something in a particular state and concerned about trying to keep that state so he can keep doing those things. And I think if at that moment he felt more like me, he would be much happier to shift into some other state or to go wherever the next mood is.
Thank you very much for that, Raven. And how would you score yourself 0 to 10 in wisdom? 0 means wisdom is not important to you at all. And this is not smarts. This is a kind of a innate knowingness. And a 9 of 10 would be very high in that.
I feel like I would score myself an 8.5 on wisdom and like a 3 on feeling that wisdom is important.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. And how about acceptance of yourself and others, Raven? Where do you score yourself 0 to 10 on that?
It's tricky. The self and others thing, maybe if I do them together, then a 7. But I think that means a very high score on self-acceptance and a moderate score on accepting others.
Good. Gotcha. Thank you. And how would you score yourself, Raven? Here you are taking off into the sky. How do you score yourself on inner peace? 0 to 10.
It's Disturbingly close to 10.
I hear you. You probably don't want to go to 10, Raven, because you want to have room to grow, right? That's
Yeah,
kind of my feeling.
got to be some
Yeah.
wiggle room there for sure.
Gotcha. It can even get better. I understand. And then how about witnessing, your ability to stand back and watch yourself go by, Raven? Where would you score yourself 0 to 10 in those?
7.5.
Okay.
It's hard to tell. It's hard to tell what being and watching means the way I feel right now.
Gotcha. And so, Raven, going back and looking at the first life issue that Layman mentioned, if you were him living his everyday life, how would you deal with that issue?
I think I would fly up at all the moments where he tries to consider how he's making decisions around food so that he could continue to make those decisions, but I would change his mood at those decision moments, at the self-evaluation.
From what to what? How would you change his mood from
I
what
would
to what?
change it to this smooth, expansive levity, to that moment where I move from just flying to being sucked up into the cloud. There's an extra smooth space that should be the space from which he's calculating how he feels about his food choices.
There, very cool. And how about his second life issue that he mentioned at the beginning, Raven? If you're in charge of his life, how would you deal with that?
Yeah, I think he mentioned money, but also some recurrent anger issues. The recurrent anger issues, it's interesting. It's the same thing about the food, about changing his mood at the decision moments. But in this case, it's not about the decision moments. It would be about changing the way he felt, observing people and getting frustrated by people when he was very little.
Mm-hmm.
I want to change his experience of his memory into this experience that I have.
And what experience do you have, Raven?
The one I mentioned before about the smooth, expansive, uplifted, destined completion feeling.
Mm-hmm. So how do you think he could transition to that when he starts to get back into that angry feeling, Raven? Do you have any thoughts about what would work for a Layman? Because you know him a lot better than anybody else.
Yeah, I almost feel like it's not about those moments. Those moments are sort of downstream of something else. It's how he relates to something about his past in the other moment, in the moments when that's not happening. That just happens or doesn't happen based on this other thing. So how could I transfer this feeling into the history of him so that that's how he experienced that? It's very I feel like I could just want to and it would happen. That sounds hilariously implausible.
Not necessarily. To me, it's a matter of what Plato called amnesis, remembering that which is a potential. Okay.
I feel like I want to, put it in a package and send it through the mail to the past. I want to ship it there.
Well, that could be a little bit of a sadhana that Layman could do if he wanted to. I mean, that could be a ritualistic puja activity that he does as a symbolic statement if he wanted to. In other words, that could be a concrete recommendation that he could do that would act as a manifested statement of who he wants to be and how he wants to deal with his choice. So he may want to do that. He may not want to do it, but I just wanted to point that out since it seemed to be what you're suggesting, Raven.
Yeah, I'm imagining the confused postman opening a mailbox and periodically finding these ritualized packages he's put in there, which would be hilarious.
It's okay to confuse the postman. Maybe needs a little confusion every now and then. Ha ha ha. Okay, and how about that money issue, Raven? I know. Well, this is my interpretation. I don't know, but I'm assuming that you probably couldn't care less about money and time and how the two relate to each other. But you're not human, and Layman and I are. And so money is a factor in reality. If you were him and had his reality, his life, how would you deal with that issue, Raven?
My only piece of advice is for him to feel the way I do. So what I want him to do is just make his decisions based on this feeling, a non-threatened feeling, and a feeling in which his impression of the systems of the world feels the way I do, rather than feels like an alien force that he's suspicious of.
So once again, Raven, do you have any more thoughts about what Layman could do to anchor your feeling into his everyday reality? Because what tends to happen is a person will do one of these interviews and they'll say, oh, that's really interesting. Next. Because it's a change in our basic scripting from our psychological geocentrism to really trusting something that is out of our everyday frame of reference and often rather far from our everyday way of looking at things. So it's not surprising that we have difficulty remembering and incorporating you into our everyday experience, Raven. So I'm just wondering if you have any more thoughts about that.
I would suggest to him, because I know he goes out into nature a lot, that he remembers this, he connects this deliberately to every time he sees a raven or crow. I would suggest that he tries to diagram my experience, because he works a lot with diagrams. But also I feel like there's a very smooth, cream-colored stone at the center of me. I think if he just had his hands on a smooth, cream-colored stone of some kind, he could probably anchor a lot of this feeling.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate very much you taking the time to answer my questions, Raven, and because Layman represents aspects of myself, this interview has been for me too. Layman is a part of me. You, Raven, are a part of me, and I've been gifted with your presence as an inspirational source to help me in my own development. So whether Layman gets anything else out of this or not, I really don't know, but I can tell you that this has been really helpful to me, Raven, to meet you, and I want to honor you for sharing your perspective with me. And now I'd like to ask Layman a couple of questions. Well, Layman, what did you hear yourself say as in this interview?
I heard myself, first of all, repeatedly describing a particular state, which is apparently very easy to get into, even though it sometimes feels like it isn't. I heard myself very quickly bypass the content of what I have remembered as a troubling dream. It seemed like that went really fast. So I feel like The foreground of the issue was not where the significance of the issue was. That's kind of what I heard from myself.
Let me just check that out by asking Raven another question. Raven, have you heard what Layman just said about how he moved from the concrete details of the dream pretty quickly into your reality, right? Okay. That makes sense to me because it was an abstract dream in the first place. But I'm just wondering, Raven, if you have any thoughts about your interpretation of the dream. You were with Layman back then, in a sense, when he had this dream. You're a part of him now. Do you have any thoughts about what that was about from your perspective, Raven?
I feel like he exaggerated the degree to which the wedge was a significant element of the dream and was a disruptor. And that he didn't pay much attention to the fold in the mass, which is where he and I both share a point of anxiety. And the sharing of that point of anxiety was key to me releasing myself, which makes me available to help release him.
Thank you for that, Raven. And Raven, if Layman, at the time when he had this repetitive dream as a child, had run into somebody who interviewed the mass and got in touch with either you or some kind of alternative personification of your characteristics that might have been more appropriate or for him at that particular age, would it have made a difference in his life and at that time in terms of how he felt about himself and also in terms of the arc of his life going forward?
I don't know if it would have changed his arc. And I mean, if he felt comfortable and trusted the person, because he likes to work it out for himself first. But I think, I think there would have been a certain increase of ease in some areas had he respected and trusted and been willing to participate in a process where I was released rather than him looking at whether or not he was released.
Mm-hmm. Well, the reason I asked that, Raven, is because it really would have made a huge difference in my life if, as a kid, I had been able to have touchstones within myself that could help me to get anchored and to get in touch with things that were authentic about who I was and where I was going, to help me sort through the scripting from my parents, the sociocultural scripting that was going on, what teachers wanted and expected, what my peers wanted and expected, was pretty overwhelming and confusing for me. And it took me quite a while to figure out, separate out all that. Okay. So that's the reason why I asked it, because it certainly would have made a huge difference. And that's one of the reasons why I actually do this work. And I have something called Dreaming Healthy Families, which is the idea of what would happen if parents interviewed children and then children turned around and interviewed parents about life issues, about dreams, or children interviewed peers. How might that help move society out of identification with the particular groupthink of the age, whether it's our groupthink now or whether it's in 500 years? There's still going to be what Jung called the collective unconscious, into which we are in a waking trance, kind of like a matrix sort of a thing, although that's kind of more nightmarish than it has to be. But from my way of thinking, we're all in a trance state all the time. It's just that we it's our normal state of mind, and so we don't really recognize it to be a trance. And the earlier we can, and the more tools that we have to wake up out of that, the better. So that's the whole idea about integral deep listening as a dream yoga, as a phenomenologically based experiential multi-perspectivalism, is that it's one more tool to help people develop, to triangulate and develop that objectivity, to sing their song, to dance their dance, to get about the business of how to have a quality life, whatever that is for them.
On this topic of trance, and it fascinates me for a number of reasons, and I've done a little bit of hypnotherapeutic work. I'm always curious what people's different take on what trance is. And when you say, like, all of our states are a trance, and if that's true, what is it that distinguishes when we say, oh, I was in a trance, or we're gonna work with trance? What makes that distinct from all the other trances that we live?
It's, to me, a differentiation between our normal state, which we do not consider to be one of being asleep or dreaming or somnambulistic or in a trance, and some other state. But when we look back at our own lives and we look at the decisions we made as a teenager, a lot of times we say, oh my God, what was I thinking? Was I in a trance? Or something. Now, when I ask you to become this mass from your dream, I'm really asking you to do something very similar to what children do routinely when they take on the perspective of somebody else and pretend they're a cowboy or an actor or a superhero or something like that. It's a light trance state. And the reason why I want it to be light is because if you zone out, everybody will be really impressed. They'll say, oh my God, Layman zoned out. He went into deep trance. He channeled, the reptilians from Rigel 12. Oh my God, how fantastic. But you won't remember a frigging thing. So how do you internalize that?
Yeah.
Okay. So a light trance allows you to participate in the experience. Plus, normally I'd be typing like mad and creating a PDF and sending that to you and asking you to read it over to remind you to reawaken the dream and also the raven perspective within you. Because you got to return to it again and again to amplify its awareness within your consciousness. Now, let me segue back to a theory that I have about why I think people who are phobic, or have anxiety states or PTSD, etc., benefit from this process, or get rid of nightmares in one session, or stop having recurring dreams they've had for years. Why does that happen? I think that the reason is that when one accesses the subjective sources of objectivity, these emerging potentials, they have your level of development. Okay, like this raven has your level of development because it's a part of you, right? But guess what? It adds to your level of development its unique perspective. So that means it has your level, and then it adds its own perspective on top of that. As you incorporate the perspective of the raven, that expands and thins your sense of self. That means it decentralizes yourself. You're no longer coming from a psychologically geocentric place. You're no longer expanding yourself to be one with everything as much as you are discreetly this or that according to what the circumstances require. Okay. So that's part of the magic of the approach in my way of thinking, and part of why it works for people, because fear is a state of constriction. Agoraphobia is an excellent example of that. everything becomes a fear to other. And so I have to get safe within myself. That's represented by my home or a certain room within my home, blah, blah, blah. And as that fear decreases, one can expand their sense of self so that one can make more of the world their home. Psychologically, that just means I'm less scared, I'm less vulnerable, I feel more secure in more circumstances. So essentially, that's what I think this yoga does, is it thins and expands our sense of self. And the thinning is very important because the more attached we are to some worldview, to one particular way of looking at ourselves, the more likely we are to set ourselves up for some kind of a problem, because we're losing adaptive function. We're not as flexible as we would be.
So this makes me curious about the relationship between development and health, because sometimes those seem like the same thing and sometimes they seem a little different, right? So when we think about it, there's other elements, right? There's Raven, and Raven has my level of development, right? Is it am I moving up, or is there sort of a plane at whatever level I'm at? Say I'm at stage 4 or whatever that is, and I've got all these other potential pieces of myself that I can gather up. And by doing that, do I necessarily develop to a higher level, or might I just be stabilizing and harmonizing myself, being more complete at the level that I'm at?
I think it's more the latter. And the reason why is that while cognitive multi-perspectivalisms focus on self-development and the cognitive line leads, in collective development, whether it's social or intrasocial, and dream yoga is intrasocial. You're developing a polycentric reality in the interior collective quadrant, basically. Okay, what happens when you do that is that you move into greater balance, and it really doesn't matter what level of development you're on. Okay. And what that also does is it means that the moral or ethical line leads instead of the cognitive line leading for collective development. And the reason why is that between you and me, you really don't give a crap at what level of development I think I am, or, I mean, what the hell does it matter? You know, you're asking things like, okay, does he respect me? Does he reciprocate? Is he trustworthy in particular areas that are important to me? And is he empathetic? Does he come across like he's sincerely interested in reading where I'm coming from, whether he agrees or not, right? Those are collective ethical issues that have to do much more with developing balance at whatever level of development we are at, rather than focusing on transcending and including, which emphasizes excellence over balance. Often it doesn't have to, but that can be a problem. It can be a real problem. Our society teaches us to do that. Our families teach us to do that. Our schools reward us for emphasizing. I mean, who cares if we're balanced? People go, gee whiz, when we're a good guitarist, or we have a lot of charisma, or stuff like that. Who cares about balance? But how high you get depends on how wide your foundation is and how stable that foundation is. And I think that has to do a whole lot with our current pathology. And in 500 years, I hope we've worked through that some, to where...
You think it's related to interpreting or assuming that we're a psychic individuality versus an intrapsychic plurality? Like, is is the ethical development keyed into this inner community thing? And if we
I
think
think
I'm
so.
just me and I keep developing, then I could do that in a way that sort of duplicates sociopathy, no matter how impressive it gets.
Or I can think, boy, if I just show Layman that I respect him, then I'm an ethical, moral person. Okay. But the real proof is the microcosm mirroring the macrocosm, which means, do I respect the mass in its fold? If I can't respect the mass in the fold, if I don't care about them at all, if I just dismiss the whole thing, then just how congruent is my exterior and my interior? Where's the match? Okay. And so that's a piece that I really think is missing. People discount their dreams. They think they're either unimportant or else they're only important if they're, quote, spiritual dreams. And you know, it really doesn't matter whether this was a spiritual dream or not. What matters is whether you respect it, whether you practice deep listening to it, which means getting out of your own way and hearing what it has to say in terms of its perspective, instead of trying to cover it with your own gloss or my own gloss. Yes?
You mentioned the imaginative play of the light trance state as something that is very similar to what children do, more or less spontaneously. And you know, sometimes when I think of children and maybe our prehistoric Aboriginal ancestors as inhabiting a kind of trance state, what we would call a trance state, as their general way of being. And then at some point in current development and also historical development, we add on this additional kind of personality, and that personality sort of takes over and thinks it's doing the developing, that it's doing the stabilizing, that it's doing the recognizing. And it's a useful adjunct, but where it conceives itself as the entity, then we get a kind of development that leaves behind our general well-being and authenticity.
Yeah, what that reminds me of is Wilber's proximal self, distal self, and the dialectic of moving into states of greater objectivity. That's all part of the developmental process, and that's well and good, but have we integrated what we're leaving behind? This work of interviewing whatever comes up in a dream or life issue is a way of doing a check on that. You know, I may think, oh yeah, I've integrated all this stuff. Well, how do I know? I'm subjectively enmeshed in my own life dream, my own trance state. This is a way of doing a check on where I am. In other words, this raven has an opinion about where you are in your development, where you're stuck, where you're not stuck. It's not God. It's not that it's perfect. But guess what? Listening to it is wisdom. Taking its perspective into account is wisdom. It doesn't mean it's right, but then you get back to triangulation. You say, okay, how does what the raven said relate to what people I respect, like Bruce Alderman, have to say, and my own common sense?
What's your take on self-destruction? Because you know, there's different ways to read this. Some people feel like it's not really a real thing. It's sort of a misreading of a disorganization, but other people have felt through history that Thanatos decoupled from Eros, or something like a demonic phenomenon might exist, that there's an element of ourselves and an element of nature that's actively trying to undermine our stability and width and development. What's your take on that?
Good question. I can tell you that modern psychology pretty much follows Hinduism and Buddhism in the belief that what we need to do is to take full responsibility for what we experience. We see that in modern psychology in saying, okay, the shape in your dream, the dots in your dream, these are all self aspects. And the purpose of that is that we cannot change what we do not own. Yeah. So if we disown something or say it's objectively other, then in a sense, we're putting ourselves in the role of victim and making ourselves powerless. So the common move in therapy is, it's your shadow. You need to reincorporate the shadow elements. And of course, 3-2-1 shadow work with Wilbur is an example of that whole, okay? Now, at certain levels of development, that's the step to do. I endorse it. At other steps, it's a mistake, okay? And the reason it's a mistake is that at some point, if we develop enough, we realize that we're taking too much responsibility. What I say is not your responsibility. You're not hearing me because it's your karma to hear what I have to say, for instance, in my belief. That's putting too much responsibility on you. And it's a grandiose idea. How that gets back to the idea of evil and demonic others is that at some stages of development, it's important to incorporate those and to say, okay, I'm creating these. Okay. At other stages, it's important to respectfully listen to the otherness of that. And that's why phenomenologically based experiential multi-perspectivalisms are basically about indeterminate ontology, which means they do not do a reductionistic step of saying, oh, the raven is basically or only an aspect of Layman. Oh, the mass is basically or only an aspect of Layman. It says, yes, partially the raven and the mass are, but they add something to him that does not respect it if you reduce it to saying, oh, that's part of his unconscious. Oh, that's his personal unconscious. Oh, that's part of his collective unconscious. It doesn't do that because they don't do that in interviews. That's not the way they present themselves. So if you're going to do deep listening, you try to listen to the worldviews of these different perspectives and see how they view evil, for instance, instead of me just putting my gloss and say, I should treat evil this way or that way. That was a roundabout way. I don't know if I answered your question or not, but there you go.
You might have, but it leads me to another question, which is, on the one hand, we look at these phenomena and say, okay, they're not just any particular interpretation of what they are, right? They are a part of you, but not necessarily only a part of you, that sort of thing. But on the other hand, there are traditions and experiences that people have of seemingly objective subtle entities of various kinds, whether it's UFOs or Bigfoot or some kind of actual glowing raven that I seem to see with my eyes open. Do you feel like those are two aspects of the same phenomenon, or do you think those are sort of different registers of phenomenon?
If I'm consistent, I'm going to respect it, which means I'm going to suspend my own assumptions, the phenomenological move, and follow Socratic elenchus, which is basically to ask questions. And that means I will punt and I will say, UFO, if you were an aspect of me, if you personified a part of me, what would that be? And it may come back and say, well, I don't. I'm objectively real. Or it might say, well, yes, if I were to be a part of you, I would represent blah, blah, blah. And then to reverse it like I did with you, with the mass, and then I say, okay, if UFO, if I were to represent a part of you, which really is to honor its objectivity, and then see at that point, I'm the subjective aspect of it, okay? Then what aspect of you would I represent? So what that really does is try to have a balancing of questions to honor that indefinite ontology, indeterminate ontology. Okay? Because I think that's the middle way here. I think it's a place that drives people nuts because they want to have non-ambiguous answers. And I'm not good with non-ambiguous answers because I'm not that smart. I'm really not. I've just been wrong so much in my life.
When you talked about, dreaming families, one of the first thoughts I had was the notion of intergenerational trauma, which sometimes I also conflate with curses on lineages. What do you think the role of this kind of approach you're talking about is in terms of working with intergenerational trauma? You know, whether a family line or a whole community or a whole race of people, because there are a lot of these sort of historically based passing on of certain habit patterns and sufferings, and the whole world is trying to figure out how to deal with that at the moment.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I've been working with who certainly have intergenerational trauma associated with the Holocaust. They live under fears of terror attack, bombings, And so I've done some interviews with them and had them, some of the parents and grandparents, interview some of their children. So I've been able to look at what the impact is on intergenerational trauma in that regard. And my belief is that what happens is that this intergenerational trauma is a form of combination of ethnocentrism, has to do with that group collective identity, and egocentrism, where for my identity, I need to hold on to that ethnocentric identity. Okay, so there's a combination there. And that what happens when people get in touch with these authentic emerging potentials, they have much more of a world-centric perspective, just intrinsically. And that when you do that over and over again, what it tends to do is to move identity from an ethnocentric and an egocentric orientation to a world-centric orientation. And therefore, to simply outgrow the intergenerational trauma the way you develop scar tissue. It doesn't mean that the wound's gone away, or if you lose a limb or you lose your sight, it doesn't mean that you miraculously have a limb or you regain your sight, but it does mean that you contextualize those in such a way that they do not interfere with who you are in your development anymore. That's what I think.
How would you distinguish between the role of the world-centric shaman compared to the tribal or ethnocentric shaman?
I think that the tribal or ethnocentric shaman is what I call traditional shamanism. Like if you grow up inside a hunter-gatherer community, then that's the kind of shamanism you're going to have because that's your worldview. So I think that it's a romantic projection to think that hunter-gatherers have that kind of a transpersonal shamanism going on. I write about that some in the essay on shamanism. I think that what we can do is we can repeat and participate in hunter-gatherer traditional shamanistic rituals. But I think that's very different than taking on their worldview because we've just outgrown it. Our worldview is much, much bigger than that worldview for various reasons. And I don't think that necessarily means that it's better. And I'm not saying that it's a waste of time to go back and to try to re-enliven those aspects of experience. Not at all. I just think we need to be honest with ourselves about we've grown, we've gotten bigger. And we're not going to interpret things the way hunter-gatherers do when we have shamanic experiences. We've got layers of meaning upon layers of meaning that have been added on from hunter-gathering. So I hope that answers the question. I'm not sure if it did or not.
Let's touch a little bit on, I guess we've been at this an hour and a half, so we're probably coming up to the end sometime soon. But let's touch a little bit on your integral critiques with the caveat that these critiques are based on the fact that it's worth critiquing, right? That it's based on an honoring and a caring for this stuff. But where do you think Ken's articulation falls short? And also in particular, where do you think Ken's impression or communication about psychology and psychotherapy might fall short?
I've mentioned a few of these already. One is reducing interior experience to self aspects. I understand why, and it's mainstream psychology. I think it puts too much responsibility on the individual, and it also discounts the overt objectivity of a great deal of experience for people. Okay, so I would nitpick on that one. Another one, and this is not just with integral actual, it's pretty much with the zeitgeist. The bodhisattva vow of saving all sentient beings doesn't include non-sentient beings. You look at Tibetan tantric deity yoga. I write about this. I have an essay on this. It's okay to visualize and become Avalokiteshvara or Manjusri, Buddha or Dakini or whatever. But to become your beige mass, no. Okay. It's not a sentient being. Okay. It's a product of your imagination. It doesn't have the objective otherness or the sacredness of Buddhas. Well, according to who? You don't know until you ask the mass. Now, it may say, oh, don't listen to me, I'm not important. Or it may manifest different aspects of the transpersonal. And let me tell you, if you look for them, you'll see a lot of aspects of the transpersonal in these emerging potentials. Why? Well, guess what? They're not born and they don't die. They're not, although they manifest in a time or space, when you interview them, they're basically timeless and spaceless. Okay? They don't really identify with their form in that they can transmute or will transmute. Causally, they're really ad hoc creations that just are like vaporware that come into reality and then leave reality. So identifying with them, although it's a subtle level yoga, it just sort of inherently introduces one to real life experiences of the causal, the formless, and even the non-dual. I mean, it took me a while to figure that out, but I'd go back and I'd read these interviews. Or if you just went back and you listened to those and just listened to it for an ear for transpersonal aspects.
It's interesting to me because in the history of philosophy, there's an interesting moment where Kierkegaard is criticizing Hegel. And he says, yeah, this system is great, but it's not quite personal enough. The key thing for Kierkegaard is some kind of inward experience, some kind of choice he's going to make. And he doesn't necessarily think that's reflected back to him in the great developmental system of Hegel. And there may be a bit of a similar thing with the integral model, which is, it's all very good, but like you're saying, identifying with Avalokiteshvara is a little bit different than working with something that comes out of yourself and being in your trance state and doing what's true for you. There's a lot of what you're saying that sounds to me like the developmental and health aspects of the integral model need to be taken more personally and less like a sort of objective, impersonal map of the world. And I think the ethics thing is a bit like that as well, because ethics and conscience and emotion, that's very personal, whereas the recognition of patterns can seem kind of impersonal.
Yes, I think it also is about the difference between an experiential multi-perspectivalism, a cognitive multi-perspectivalism, and an experiential. Right. The way I define an experiential is it's about disidentification from who you are or I am, and identifying with some other perspective to some degree. It could be light trance, moderate trance, could be heavy trance. But there's this process of disidentification and identification that makes something experiential. Where if it's a cognitive multi-perspectivalism, we're looking at an objectivity through the lens of our level of cognitive development. Right. Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that. We need that. But if we don't differentiate those,
is that analogous to your geocentric and heliocentric difference?
No, it's more analogous to the geocentric and the polycentric difference, I would say.
What do you get from writing essays? Because you write a lot of them and on a huge range of topics. What does it do for you?
Clarifies my own thinking, and it also gets me a little bit of feedback from people who either violently disagree or maybe have some suggestions. It's a way to question my own sanity. Like, am I just being stupid? Am I just being critical to be critical? Do I have anything to say to add that makes any difference? Or is this just me doing some kind of cerebral vomit? I'm really not sure. Again, multi-perspectivalism says, yeah, there's a lot of truth in all those different points of view.
Well, I'm certainly having a nice time getting to know you a little better. Is there anything on your mind that you want to mention, or anything you want to bring up before we finish? I'm sort of out of questions.
I'm really interested in kids getting off to a whole lot better start in life than they do. Maybe more than ever, kids are exposed to different influences through the internet. They're torn in different ways. They're pushed to think this way or to be that way. And I think a lot of that suffering, confusion, false starts, mistakes along the way is unnecessary. It's just unnecessary. And to me, it's a avoidable tragedy. And, what I would like my work to do is to contribute to a movement that 500 years from now, parents are sitting down with their kids and they're doing interviews with them and teaching their kids to interview them back. Right. Not so that they move to adult relationships, because you've got roles of parents and you've got roles of kids, and that's important. But you can take a time out from those and honor individuals for their uniqueness outside of the ever-present pressure of parents and teachers for kids to be in self-control. You need to have more control over yourself. I need to be more in control. If I'm out of control, bad things happen. If I'm in control, good things happen. Well, these interviews really are not about control at all. They're really about giving up control. And that's one of the reasons why it's difficult for a lot of people and for a lot of parents to do these with kids, is because parents really need to feel like they're in control and to feel like their kids think that they are in control of, so they can feel secure and guided and da-da-da-da-da. A little of that goes a long way, and I think there's way too much of it in society. People need to have a break these interviews are designed to really develop three core qualities. One is a sense of abundance based on thankfulness. A second is cosmic humor, where you don't take the dramas of life so seriously, watch yourself go by. And a third is what I call luminosity. And luminosity is just the ability to appreciate the transparentness of time and space and identity. And this is all tied into pranayama that we haven't talked about at all. But I have a whole gig on pranayama. And these qualities that we mentioned in the interview of confidence and empathy, wisdom, acceptance, inner peace, and witnessing are tied into 6 stages of every breath. And the whole idea is to help to awaken these and to balance these within the individual and to use the breath as an anchor.
Do you have kids, Joseph?
Yeah, I have a daughter. She's 32 now.
How do you think you did in terms of providing a context where those qualities, luminosity and cosmic humor, were able to come forth in that relationship and in that person who is your daughter?
Well, Layman, I have sadness about that because part of me doesn't feel like I did a very good job. Her mother is a very dominating, critical person. And I think my daughter's worldview, we did interviews. We did a lot of interviews. And she won't have anything to do with the process at this point in her life, you know? And at the time, they seemed to me to be useful and helpful to her. But she is like this on the whole thing. And I'm kind of sad about that. Maybe she'll get back to it one day. Maybe, you know, it just doesn't fit into who she is. She's a neurologist. Okay. And you can imagine the kind of focus and the kinds of priorities that is. Her mother's wonderful in a lot of ways. Let's just say that she has different priorities. And I have always been kind of framed by her and my daughter as being woo-woo. And I think that's probably been true for a lot of my past. I think I have been woo-woo in a lot of ways.
Okay. Well, maybe we should do another one of these about pranayama at some point, because how to better assimilate air and its subtle qualities is an area of constant ongoing experimentation for me. But nonetheless, this has been fantastic. I liked seeing you and getting to know you, and I'm sure everybody else who's only seen you writing things will be happy to see a little bit more of who you are and what processes you're working with.
Well, I've got a question. How did you get to be so amiable and handsome at the same time? I'm just so envious.
That's going to require an entire other video, I think. We'll have to go through a process on that. There's certain people I like, and you're in that category of people I like. So it's not difficult to be amiable with people who are open to a wide variety of dimensions of the human experience.
Let me just leave you with this. The interview that you did is meant to be chewed over, returned to, reflected upon, and integrated as something that's sacred to you and for you, independent of what I think of it or what my interpretations might be. And the more you do that, the more you're nurturing not only yourself and your own development, but you're aligning yourself with what I call evolutionary autopoiesis, which means whatever is attempting to be born for the human race has to be born within each of us as individuals. And that's a very important thing to realize, that we can have these experiences that connect us with the evolutionary arc of the species, not just our own personal development.